Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table, where we talk about role-playing, game design, hobbies, project planning, world building, and all things creativity.
So today we're going to be talking about world building, and we won't be building a world today. We're going to talk about how you build worlds.
So last time on Joe's Table, our first podcast, we went ahead and started building a world. But one of the things that we realized in the process of that was that a lot of people like to build worlds. They just aren't enabled and empowered to do it efficiently enough to make use of them, right? There's a lot of people out there who have fun doing world building exercises and then never get to actually use those worlds.
So today we're going to give you some advice on how to make world building a more efficient thing and make it a lot easier.
Hopefully make it more useful to you as a GM more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start right off the bat with wikis, because I think probably the biggest tip that I would want to give people, and the thing that I want to jump up and down and scream about the most, is make yourself a wiki. I've seen that there's a website called Campaign Wiki, which is kind of like media wiki, where you can add pages and edit things and then show that campaign wiki to other users.
Mm-hmm.
But it's my major problem with most wikis has always been I want to use them as notes while I'm running, and I need it to be efficient for me to do that. And Campaign Wiki, the website, didn't really serve that function. I've got a video about that, I think, that I can talk about. But since that video, we've come across a much better new option called Obsidian.md, which is a application that edits Markdown files.
And it's originally made for a process called Zettelkasten, which basically you're documenting everything you've encountered, but it makes it really easy to link and set up different pages and link all of those pages together.
We're talking stupid easy.
Yeah.
It's basically as fast as you can write, you can build up a wiki. Now let's take a step back and discuss why you would want a wiki. I think a lot of people think of planning out a campaign or doing world building in a very linear mindset. And I think that disaffords the players of your game the ability to change their minds and to do other stuff that they would want to do, right? If you plan linearly, you're inherently locking people into a linear story, and we don't want to do that. We want to make it so that players are free to choose whatever they want to do in the game world, and that they can pursue whatever course of action makes sense to them at the time, right? It's kind of silly to build a world around the idea of possibly having a mistake in your world building or in your plot line that the players are going to dodge. Players are notorious for dodging plot hooks. They're never going to take the route that you intend for them to take. So it's very important to build your world non-linearly, and I think a wiki is probably the best way to do that.
Now, I will say I do a lot of my initial world building on paper, but I do frequently move over to some sort of a digital format later on, just because it gets to be so much to manage on paper that I end up making these crazy diagrams that have arrows and lines going from place to place.
Flowcharts.
Bad flowcharts. So Wiki makes it much easier to manage.
Right. And the one of the greatest parts about Obsidian is that it's better than a normal wiki, because it has a directed chart built into it that shows you what's linked to what leads where, and you can kind of browse it as a network diagram and see, who's connected to who or where things are and what they're related to, which is really, really cool.
So this is now an ad for Obsidian.
Not sponsored. # not sponsored.
Yeah.
Come at us, Obsidian. Come and do it.
But, having some sort of a resource like Obsidian or something else is really helpful when you're getting into building a big expansive world that has lots of connections, just to be able to keep track of those connections without forgetting what goes where and what, hooks up to what, so that when you're running, and you've got that at your fingertips. So if your players suddenly decide to talk to that one random character you hadn't expected them to talk to, you can easily connect them up with something and get them kind of fit into the world lore because you've got it all there at your fingertips.
And I think the other thing about it is you don't even necessarily actually have to have a wiki. I think the important thing is to think about your world as a wiki, not a story. Don't think of your world building exercise or your campaign plan as a linear story. Think about it as a web of situations, connections, and people, right? That's, I think, the important lesson. Even if you can build your wiki like as an actual Zettelkasten and make it a bunch of note cards or whatever, or keep it in a notebook, so long as you're not saying A is going to happen, then B is going to happen, and then C is going to happen, and the players will choose A, then B, then C, and this is how it will occur. That's just not. It's not realistic, and it's not fun.
And I think that's an important distinction between world building and campaign building. It's a lot easier to build a world that you can then run a game in than it is to build a campaign and expect your players to follow along with where you want the story and the campaign to go. You're setting yourself up for trouble if you expect your players to want to go along precisely with the story that you're trying to tell. Like at that point, it's easier just to write a book,
right?
Than expect them to kind of railroad along where you want to go. They're going to find a different path to take, and it's going to drive you up a wall.
That is fundamental to being a player. Is derailing a railroading GM. That's just how it works.
Yeah.
Don't assume that your game will be any different from all the other games that have ever happened, basically.
They're going to adopt a pig. They're going to decide to challenge the massive army. They're going to do something completely unexpected.
They're going to befriend your final boss.
And you have to roll with it.
You got to roll with it. And that's much easier to do when you think about your campaign or your game world as a wiki, as a network of things rather than a linear story. That sounded almost kind of preachy. Use a wiki, damn it. Next up, I think this one also kind of applies whether you're using an actual wiki software or if you're just doing it on paper. Use bullet points. Don't write big expansive paragraphs, because big expansive paragraphs generally lead you down the path of this is how it is and it's got to be this way, right? Like then you're setting yourself up in the wrong way to say everything is pre-planned out. You're getting more towards the story side rather than the planny kind of network graph kind of side.
Yeah, use a bullet point to track the idea, the thought, or the feeling that you have for something. But yeah, definitely don't go too much into detail. And that gives you the flexibility later on if you decide that you don't like how something, was, how you originally conceived something, that you're not as locked into it, that you can then later, so you can change things on the fly as the mood of the game doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, what that really does is it affords you both more flexibility and more speed. It's just more efficient because the trap you can easily get into is you've written too much detail, right? And what that looks like is you'll be running your game along, and then you'll say the characters run into this character, the players run into this character, and then you want to use that character to accomplish some goal in the story, to turn some part of the story for the players. But if you've pre-written that they don't know that thing, and that they have a very specific set of goals or reasons to exist, or like personality traits or whatever it is, you lose the flexibility to turn that person into the person you need them to be on the fly. You kind of set yourself up in this kind of mental trap where you're like, no, that's not how it is. It can't be that way, right? And even if you think you're a flexible GM and you can, kind of seat of the pants a lot of things, just the idea that you've written that stuff down makes you more inclined to try to force things the way you wrote them down. So it's more flexible if you just use bullet points. You can have a lot of bullet points, but like try not to make those bullet points overly detailed, Just try to keep them one abstract idea each, And then you can use those more efficiently to say, okay, this character might be connected to this. They might be connected to this other thing. They might have this trait. They might be like this. Notice that I'm using a lot of mights. That's kind of a point that I guess we didn't plan for, that we didn't talk about in advance, was that I tend to prefer my world building and campaign building as like a series of, it could be like this, right? Instead of saying it's gonna be like this. And I think that's kind of an important distinction, right? Like, I guess I had never thought about that before, that I try to write my plans so that they're malleable, ductile.
Yeah.
They're like a fine metal, right? You can rework them. They're like gold. You can rework them and reshape them as you need, which means thinking about things in terms of mights instead of R's and will be's.
Yeah. And it might sound like your players could get away with a lot in this system, and it can very much happen, but there are ways to guide them and steer them in here as well. So there are layers to that.
Yeah, and I think that the other side of that coin is that your players are going to get away with a lot, and you're deluding yourself as a GM if you think that you can control what they're going to do and like the way they're going to do it. So you got to own that flexibility. You got to own that, like, the chaos of it, and be like, okay, yeah, I'm ready for them to decide that they're going to go do this crazy thing, as opposed to setting yourself up that, no, it's going to have to be this way, and either I force everybody to play this way and everybody gets sad and nobody wants to play anymore, or we play the way that they want to play and now I'm sad because things aren't going my way.
And that's why it's very important at the beginning of a game to have that conversation of, like, as a group, do we want this to be a silly game? Do we want this to be a serious game? You know, what do we want from this game? To kind of help set those guidelines and ground rules, and also be aware that that will change as the game goes on. So you might start out really serious and then go off in a yakety sax adventure halfway through because everyone's just like, I'm done being serious. So, you know, just be flexible.
Yeah. People change over time, campaigns change over time, and, you know, the world feel and the situation can evolve as new characters are introduced or as old characters, you know, fade away or whatever. And yeah, like the entire tone of the campaign can shift pretty dramatically over time, especially when you don't play that frequently.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about not planning too deeply in detail. Let's also talk about the other major thing that I rag on a lot, which is injecting conflict. This is kind of my, I think, pet peeve. I don't know if it's a pet peeve because it doesn't really bother me so much, but when I'm always trying to convince other people that they need to do this thing whenever I'm involved in somebody else's world building exercise. What I mean by that is whatever you're building, whatever kind of world you're building, always try to look out for places where you can make conflicts exist independent of the players, because then you can always draw them into those conflicts or throw those conflicts up around them as they stumble into a situation. And then that makes the world feel very active and vibrant, and it provides you more interesting content to go on rather than like just saying, oh, well, yeah, there's the land of elves. We're in the land of elves now. What do we do? Well,
it's all happy and fine and dandy and there's nothing wrong here. No, there's somebody backstabbing somebody else. And like, that's definitely happening.
Right. It's always easier to kind of drop an idea and not use it in the context of the game while you're at play than it is to kind of coin something major and complicated at the drop of a hat, right? So you're kind of, that sounds like it's contradictory to the, like, don't pre-plan too many things, but keep in mind you want to keep these things short, simple, and bullet point and non-detailed, right? So the idea of like what are the conflicts that exist in the Elvish lands? Maybe you're right. Maybe there are like kind of backstabbing Elvish secret factions that are all trying to vie for power or something. Suddenly that is a way more interesting situation to be in than we went to the Elvish lands and there were elves there. You know what I mean? Like, you have a lot more content for the players to to enjoy that way.
Yeah, so that's kind of how you have it set up in Oubliette, right? With each chapter and section having some hooks and descriptions of things that you could possibly do if you end up in that section.
Right, absolutely. So in Oubliette, we specifically went out of our way to have 2 to 3 or 4 hooks for pretty much every section in the book. So like all the NPCs, all the areas in the book, all the character archetypes and the various races, they all have hooks associated with them. Each of those hooks is kind of like a little self-contained challenge or problem that might arise. And again, might, right? So we say kind of in the book, don't worry if some of these don't jive up with the way you want to run your game. They're here as options, right? They're here as things that you could possibly draw on to add more conflict and interest to your game and keep your game kind of spiced up and moving and doing things.
Yeah, so if you reach a point in your session where you're like, wait, what do? I didn't expect to be here. You've got something to pull on potentially.
If they end up off the map, off your game plan, and they run off into the bounding, you can just pull open the bounding chapter and be like, okay, here's a problem.
Yeah.
You can just drop them right in on that. The next thing that we're going to talk about is called the switchboard engine, which is kind of my personal philosophy for designing storytelling systems that are going to be collaborative. So talking about both designing campaign settings and designing campaigns themselves. So both of those two things kind of fit into the switchboard engine. We're only going to talk about this a little bit because we're going to probably do an entire episode just on this topic later on. The overview is basically you start with plugs for all of your player characters and their backgrounds and like the major NPCs and characters of the story. And then you start thinking up endpoints. So, and plot beats, and those are things that you want to happen. Like, is there going to be like a giant dragon attack? Is the villain going to try to capture somebody's love interest or something like that? And you don't know how they fit up. You don't pre-plan how those things are going to fit together. And the idea behind the switchboard engine is that you keep those things open until you absolutely need to start dialing in on those details. And that allows you this really cool kind of flexibility because it seems like you knew what was going to happen the whole time, but you're sort of just waiting for the opportunity to deploy the things that you planned.
Mm-hmm. And so that means that you end up throwing a lot of different potential things up in the air, a lot of bricks in the air that will maybe come down at some point in the future, maybe not. And you don't necessarily know, and your players definitely don't know what's going to come back down and what will just kind of disappear until the last session and then hit like a ton of bricks.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know what a brick joke is, what Liz is talking about is a trope where you set up some kind of expectation by what we say throwing a brick in the air, and then you have some other conversation entirely, and then at some later point, after the punchline of the second or third joke, the punchline of the first joke finally comes back around, and that's the delivery of the brick. That's the brick coming back down because you put a brick in the air.
Look it up, TV tropes, brick joke.
That's the part that's going to stay on the podcast. Look it up, TV tropes, brick joke, toss. Okay, so we were also going to talk about ask a lot of questions. So the other key ingredient into the switchboard engine is kind of mining your players for data. This is a thing that I personally do a lot that I guess I don't see other GMs do very much. But it's one of my favorite things is basically what you do is you provide them an open question and say like, okay, well, this is what has happened. You guys don't understand what's going on yet. What could possibly be the situation? What could possibly be going on? And you ask the players to start arguing about it, and you see what their different points of view are and you kind of rile them up. You get the players to argue with each other about like what could possibly be going on.
And you also do this during like last session recaps too, where you ask the players what happened during the last session and then get them to tell back what happened, but all from their own unique points of view. which I guess gives you kind of an idea of like what everybody retained and was paying attention to and what are the important things to them.
Right. And also like what misunderstandings everyone has had. That's my favorite part is what misapprehensions people have of facts that other people have better apprehensions of, because like once you have the players disagreeing about how things happened or what happened or what was going on, now you have different points of view that you can rely on, that make it seem like you knew what was going on the whole time, and you can kind of tap into those things and say, okay, that's not a bad idea. Maybe I'll use that. If somebody's like, yeah, no, it could only have been a werewolf, then you're like, oh yeah, shit. That's a way better idea than I had an idea for.
And it actually helps your players feel like they're invested and involved in the world, that their like crazy guesses are actually paying off. They're like, oh my gosh, I actually know what's going on. When in reality, they actually just predicted what was going on.
Yeah, they almost just directed it. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite techniques to use in the switchboard engine, and it relies exclusively on you not pre-planning things as a GM. It's very much harder to do that when you have a very strict outline to adhere to. Now, I think to kind of wrap up the switchboard engine and possibly this section of this podcast, the real trick of things seems to be that you have to be kind of ready to seat of the pants a lot of stuff. You have to be ready and willing to improvise and able to kind of see your own plot as a series of things, right? As a network of things that you can kind of pluck on and connect to. So it helps to have something like a wiki where you can kind of browse it and refresh your memory and keep a lot of those things kind of in your short-term memory so that you're kind of always thinking about all the different possibilities that could happen. And that's a lot easier to do when you have like a wide, kind of broad set of notes rather than a really deep, specific, specialized like plot path.
Once again, gives you that flexibility to kind of go where the players are going and where they want to go rather than being stuck in your, one single stream of plot, right, and then getting frustrated when the players have wandered off somewhere else.
And it can feel very unnerving at first to try to run the game this way because you don't really know what's going to happen. And I know that a lot of first-time GMs get very concerned when they're not in control of the story. But I think that's really you don't ever really have that much control over the story as a GM. You have a lot less control over it than you think you do because you're basically outnumbered by a bunch of people who have a lot of very big and powerful powers, i.e. the players, right? I guess my advice is to kind of let go and let the story evolve the way it's going to happen. Ask questions and start connecting things.
And I guess for how to do the world building itself, one of the big things that we can talk about is, I don't know about you, but I find reading a lot of different things, looking a lot of different, role-playing books and history books and webcomics and media and movies and stuff like that actually give me a ton of inspiration. And I spend a lot of time like carefully cutting out little tiny bits I like from one thing or another thing and smushing them together. So don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to be like, you know what? I like this one thing from Star Wars and I like this one thing from British history.
Right.
I'm just going to smush them together and make something interesting.
Absolutely.
That I think is cool. And that's a great way to do it.
Right. Absolutely. Especially because there's just so much more material out there than you can possibly even come up with yourself. You can very easily pick and choose and be like, I'm gonna put Darth Vader in British colonial India kind of scenario, and that's the backdrop for these players who are now like Indian rebels against this new empire. Like there's just so much that you can steal from and utilize.
Yeah. And especially if you need like political intrigue, look back in the past. There's plenty of it. It's fun. It's juicy. It's interesting. It's bloody. It can be perfect if you want to run that sort of a game.
In addition to those things, I also like to listen to music. A lot of my inspiration for plot lines and for world feels and world building kind of aesthetics comes from music. I listen to music pretty much constantly throughout the day, and I can listen to a good song and like kind of have like a whole mental image of a world and a story kind of appear in my head, and like that can be enough, right? That can be enough for either like a whole story or for like just a section of some particular part of a campaign, like a character or a place or something like that.
Yep, definitely. And one other thing, this is just kind of a little side note that will make your life easier as you're running a game. Have a list of names available.
Oh my God, yes.
Like, do some prep work to just have a list of random names. You know, you can find them, go to any one of the name, you know, baby name or, you know, name sites out there on the internet, and just get a list of interesting sounding names, toss it in a document somewhere. It will make your life so much easier when your players wander off and meet some random character and you're like, oh no, I need to have a name for them. Just grab your list, find something that fits for that character, give it to them, bam. And then you've already made a character that seems much, much more interesting rather than just saying, oh yeah, it's a blacksmith, you know, on the road, whatever, cool. You know, no, that's Bob the blacksmith. And already that's a more interesting character.
Because he's got alliteration.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that always helps.
And kind of an addendum on that is like to extrapolate that same kind of behavior as a GM, I would also suggest doing that kind of thing for NPCs themselves and villains especially, where you can like kind of mine your favorite characters from media and just make a list of them, right? And just have that list available to you during your game. Both during when you're doing your planning, because then that's probably when you want to be coining most of your NPCs, but also during the game so that you can kind of look at your list and be like, yes, this is Bob the blacksmith, and he's like the character from Kingdom of Heaven. So he's got some kind of troubled past and he's on a pilgrimage, right? So now we've got a very interesting character with a lot of interesting implications to him that came from like a name and a person from a movie, right? And that's all we really needed. And now the players are going to be like, oh, well, what happened? And you can just start kind of, I mean, forgive the crudeness, but you can just start bullshitting about like what this character's goals are and like why he's been on his journey or his pilgrimage or whatever. So yeah, having a list of possible NPCs and possible villains, you know, of your favorite characters that you know as how they would function and how they work, because then you can quickly weaponize those.
Yeah. And as a player, Bob is now in the party and we're helping him with his crusade.
Yep. I should have foreseen this. Maybe if I had used the switchboard engine, I would have been ready for that.
So now we've given you a bit of an idea about how we world build and how you can use those tools to make your world building more effective and easier. We'll probably be talking about some more of these things in detail, especially the switchboard engine in later episodes. We will be doing some more world building episodes as well in the future. I've actually already recorded a secret hidden one where I'm building a game for Joe, but that won't be out for a while.
Right, because I can't edit that until we've played it. So
yeah, because there's lots of secrets in there.
Spoilers.
Yeah. So stay tuned for more world building stuff.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table signing off. See you next time, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Peace.